Hey guys, what is up? Welcome to another Rev Question of the Week. It's a crazy season right now. We just found out that the stay-at-home goes until at least the very beginning of June. It's just a wild time for all of you guys, students out there. We feel for you. We're praying for you. I can't imagine how crazy of a time that is to try and do school while doing it completely online. You know, if you would have told me back in February and March that the coronavirus would turn into this, I wouldn't have believed you. I mean, back in February, I remember me and Joe, we were in the office and we were like talking, joking, like, oh, like it's going to shut us down. You know what I mean? And I remember, and I quote, I think I told Karina, our student ministry admin, I said, there's no way we get shut down.
Yeah.
That's the worst take I've ever had. And here we are, we're going to be in this until June.
Yeah. Well, and we're on week 7 now?
I think so. Yeah.
So it'll be like 11 weeks at least until things kind of.
At least.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah, because this will be our 7th week of our YouTube NHSM Online.
Totally.
This Thursday. So by the way, also on that, if you haven't watched them, go check them out. It's right on the YouTube channel you're watching. They're super fun. So if you haven't met before, my name's Evan. I lead our middle school ministry here at New Heights. This is Joe. He leads the high school ministry at New Heights. And we're actually doing something pretty fun rarely do we get an opportunity to do events that are combined, but we're going to do one this Thursday. So this Thursday, that is May 7th, from 11 to 12, you can drive by the church and get a free Frosty from the student ministries team. We're going to be wearing masks. Yep. You know, we'll all have gloves on. The Frosties are going to be out on a table, so it's going to be no contact. You'll be able to just drive by, pick up a Frosty, but you'll also be able to say hi to me and Joe, and it's going to be really fun.
And a few members from our team.
Yep.
And it will be at New Heights main campus.
Yep.
And so the other thing is, like, Evan checked the forecast this week, and we're looking at like 80, 85 degree weather going into this weekend. So come enjoy some ice cream with us before you head into a pretty toasty weekend.
Yep. It's going to be hot. Yep. I'm building a fence this weekend, and I just picked the perfect weekend to be outside. And also because I've been in quarantine, dude, I'm pasty. I'm real white. So, I mean, it's going to be brutal. So
totally.
So part of Rev Question of the Week, guys, is every week we try to answer some of your tough questions. You guys are the ones that are texting in these questions to us. You're going to see a number right in the description. That number goes directly to the student ministries team, and we compile a list of your questions. And when you guys text them in, we sort them out and we try to deal with them a week at a time. It's really fun. Me and Joe are both really passionate about we believe that we have an academically and intellectually rich faith. It's one of my favorite things about my faith is obviously my personal relationship with the Lord is what gives me joy. But man, it's just so good to explore the richness and deepness of our faith. And it's fun. So this first question is from a high school student. Actually, I think it says, is the Bible a real book telling a real story? So is the Bible a real book telling a real story? Joe, I think I'm just going to let you run with this one. And tell me what you think when you hear that question.
Yeah, I think it is a really good question. And so if I'm going off on a rabbit trail, you'll have to stop me, and then I'd love, for you to chime in too. But in terms of it being a real book, well, I definitely think, would you say the question is like saying, is it a legitimate book?
Yeah. Is it reliable? Is the Bible, for example, I'm reading, actually, Joe and I are both reading Harry Potter right now. So is the Bible like Harry Potter?
Yeah.
Or is the Bible a legitimate historical document that actually means something for my life? That's what when they're saying real, I think that's what they mean by real.
Yeah, totally. Well, and that's where I think, let me just start with the first one. I definitely think it's a real story. And I think time and time again, and I don't think, I think at some level we're going to have to, we can be confronted with as much evidence, like you're saying. I think we do have a very evidence-based faith. I really do. I think time and time again, people have questioned the authenticity of the Bible, and it's crazy how much archaeological evidence has like even in the last 100 years has shown that like the Bible's legitimate. But even like you for years people questioned like did Pontius Pilate actually exist, you know, like because there's very little historical documents that even verified the existence of this person that all four gospel accounts bring up. And then like 60 years ago in Israel, they found the plaque dedicated to his name in Caesarea Maritima. Like, and then like same thing with like people wondered if Canaanites actually existed, like the Hittites. And 75 years ago, they discovered the city. It was buried underneath. It was buried underneath like, you know, feet and like a ton of rubble and everything because, you know, Israel's been fought over for years and they just build on top of things. But I say all that just to say, is it a real story? We have a ton of historical evidence that you and I could go in for hours and talk about. We could verify the stories of the Exodus. We could verify the stories of obviously Jesus existing. We can verify, there's just a lot of archaeological and historical documents that verify the story. Now with the book, is it legitimate? And I think that's where there's a ton of compelling evidence as well.
And Joe, really quick, you're doing a good job. You're differentiating between verifying the event of Jesus that happened, and now you're moving on to talking about the actual book that recorded the events.
Because I think like you'll hear a lot of people say like, oh, the Bible, especially like people like, there was like a book when you and I were probably in middle school, high school that had come out called The Da Vinci Code. Do you remember that?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. And it was like when that book came out, which by the way, it's a fictional book. Like, but when
it was
you
written
and
in the mid 1900s.
Yeah. It was actually written in like the late 1990s.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. That's right. Even more recent.
But like when it came out, everyone was like, this book proves that the Bible and Christianity is all wrong. And it was,
and movies made about it.
Yeah, like literally like Tom Hanks is like stars in a movie, like 2 movies about it. But what was fascinating to me is like, one, it's a fictional book, like it's literally a work of fiction. And yet so many people use that as like the platform by which to say, man, like Christianity is not legit. What's interesting is from that, like started spurring on some of these like comments that like, oh, the Bible was written in 400 AD at the Council of Trent.
Yes.
Just like a group of guys around a table and they were like, let's just write the Bible. And that is so far from the truth of what actually happened with the Bible. Like so I say that just to start with saying like, is the Bible like a real book or is it legitimate? Because I think people think it's a group of men who got together hundreds or thousands of years after the fact and were like, let's write about it. And then that's the Bible. That's not the case at all.
Yeah, they wrote stories for personal gain, a lot of people say. And so, Joe, so walk me through, if it's not the Council of Trent and it wasn't just a bunch of dudes like me and you know, gathering and just saying, hey, man, let's just make up this story about Jesus to help ourselves out. How did we get to where we are with the Bible?
Totally. And I think an additional question onto that is like people also ask like, how do we know what books should have been in the Bible? Because there's other documents around the same time, even around the same subject matter that was not considered part of the Bible.
When they decided to pick the stories that were in the Bible, how did they decide to pick which weren't going to be part of it and which were?
Before I like hop there, like let me just like one last thought on the real Jesus, because this is starting to get me to think a little bit. But like there was long story short, like when people ask like, are these real stories? We're now getting to the point where people recognize Jesus as a historical figure. Like,
absolutely.
So now like in scholarship, like it's not even a question of did Jesus exist? Nope. He definitely existed. But now people who aren't Christians, like they're trying to say, well, there's a historical Jesus and then there's a biblical Jesus. Because now like, for hundreds of years, there was a movement that, oh, Jesus didn't exist. He wasn't a real figure. And now all of the evidence is pointing to he absolutely was a real figure who actually existed. And that's undeniable.
Even the circumstances around his resurrection are widely considered among scholarship. For example, there being an empty tomb, that his tomb was discovered by women, that his followers experienced appearances of Jesus post his death and resurrection, that that his followers died, and now we've moved into a stage where we're not debating whether or not these events took place. We're trying to explain the events. And so now
Totally.
what people have to do, even when looking at the resurrection, is not to say that there wasn't an empty tomb. They have to try and explain why the tomb was empty.
Yeah. And that's where, like, I even think in that case, like, just from a posture, like, if someone was making up that story, let's just like use the resurrection as an example. Yep. Christianity was illegal in the Roman Empire for 200 years. Like, as in, so why would a group of poor, uneducated fishermen choose to die over a false story that they just conjured up out of nowhere?
Yep.
Like, they literally were willing to get beaten and tortured and killed. Like, Peter got crucified upside down.
Yep.
And why would all these men go through that to die for a story that was made up?
And on top of that, a story that held, I often know that when historians are approaching a ancient book or an ancient text like the Bible, they'll often put it through a series of tests to test its reliability. And I know that one of those tests is, are there embarrassing facts inside of the text themselves? Like, for example, like you said, why would they include, well, of course, back then women weren't seen with the same level of testimony. Why would they include women?
They couldn't testify in court.
Exactly. Why would they include women covering the tomb? Why would Peter, if he made up the story, include himself being the person to deny Jesus 3 times?
Yeah. And like, theoretically, like, think about if you were making up the story, Jesus would show up to the most educated, the wealthiest, the most influential in society.
Yep.
Instead,
he showed up influence.
He showed up to women, which I'm not saying I think women were incredibly influential, and I think Jesus knew that. But in the first century, they weren't seen that way. And then I think number 2, it's like, why would he show up to a bunch of uneducated fishermen, tax collectors? It's like the people who did not have influence. And yet, like, look at the evidence of, like, him revealing himself to them. Like, this movement spread throughout all, like, the face of the earth. And, like, to me, it's like, you look at these events and you're like you're saying, that embarrassing fact, that is a way in which they recognize the authenticity of the story. Because if you were going to make up the story, chances are you would cover those bases. Even stuff like the chief leaders of the movement, the disciples and the apostles, they're seen in a very negative light in their stories. So it's just like all that to say, like, it's fascinating when you look at the events and you're recognizing there is authenticity here in terms of how, like, the Bible is put together. Like, I think a way to think about it, because we oftentimes, like, think, they're like fairy tales. And I think part of the struggle is sometimes we teach them like fairy tales.
Absolutely.
Like, we teach them like the Little Red Riding Hood or The Boy Who Cried Wolf. And then, like, we give a little, like, fable type message at the end of each story.
Well, yeah, I mean, the crucifixion is in children's books.
Totally.
You know, I mean, you think about it that way. I mean, Jesus had metal nails driven through his body onto wood. And we talk about it like it's a Disney movie.
Totally. You know? And I'm not saying that's inherently bad. I'm not saying like we need to teach it to kids. I'm just saying, if that's where our level of interaction with the story, like, if that's as deep as it goes, like, it's no wonder why we struggle with, did this really happen? I think as well, like, we have had, like, we're in a postmodern society. So we view things from at least some lens of modernity. Like, we view it from a scientific angle, which is not bad. It's part of our culture. But what I'd say is, like, I'm going to state something.
Yep. Yeah. Walk us through it.
Yeah. And just because it's going to frame the rest of my conversation. But is the Constitution a valid document?
Like the American Constitution?
Yeah. Or is the Declaration of Independence, let's say. So you and I believe that there were all those men that gathered together, you know, John Hanson, Benjamin Franklin, like, all of these men gathered together in Philadelphia, signed this document. And
did you say John Hanson? Is that John Hancock?
Oh, John Hancock. Thank you. Sorry. Not John Hanson, but John Hancock. Like, all these guys got together, signed the Declaration of Independence, and you and I view that story, one, as 100% factual, and that document as 100% valid.
Yep.
But was anyone else there to verify that account?
Yeah, that's a great point. No,
And
outside of the
and
men in the room.
and how do we know that someone else didn't just take that document and mess with it a little bit?
Right, we know because there was independent sources, correct?
Yeah.
All the men told the story independently.
Well, and I say that because like you expand on that with like the Bill of Rights and all of these things. It's not like we had recording or anything like that of these events. We take them at the word because and those documents and the story surrounding them became part of the cultural fabric of our society. We assume them to be true.
Yep.
But you and I weren't there, and we can actually validate that the document is the same as, we can't. We just take it to be true, and it makes up our cultural heritage. I say all that because we like C.S. Lewis has this like phrase that he called chronological snobbery.
Mm-hmm.
And it's this assumption that because we live today, we're smarter than the people who lived 2,000 years ago.
Yep.
But I think people are people no matter what. And they use the tools given to them to share these cultural narratives and these. So I say all that just to say they're not stupid. It wasn't a bunch of dumb people who were trying to create a story. These were people who saw events and they did the best they could to record them as accurately as they could. And it was so important to them because it made up their cultural identity. So here's like, just to give you an example, the Bible was written by 40 different authors over 1,500 years in 3 different languages on 3 different continents.
Yep.
Now, to tell you how insane it is that the Bible is as cohesive and legit as it is with those stats, just think about it.
It's miraculous. Yeah.
Let's say we take 40 different people just from Washington State, just from one state, not even our whole country, but Washington State. And we take 40 different people and we tell them, let's write a story about a cat, a cat living in the state of Washington. Just like write a story about a cat. And you got 40 different people to write that story, you would not have a coherent story at all, right? Correct?
No, dude, even if you ask 40 people to write a story, even more so about an event, let's say, hey, write a story and tell me what's happening with COVID.
Totally.
You know what I mean? Yeah, so.
We would have 40 different perspectives, and they would oftentimes they would conflict. They wouldn't be they wouldn't coincide with one another. Now, start to stagger that. Let's say you and I write a story with someone who existed 50 years ago, or expand it even farther to like put it into a frame of reference. Imagine writing a story with someone from the year 500 AD. Like someone like we're approaching the dark ages, like just to think about that. And imagine you and me writing a story that's coherent with that person.
Yeah, it's pretty wild.
Like we could not do it, like in terms of language, in terms of cultural thought. Like, so I say all that just to say there has to be something that oversees it, because we're talking about 3 different continents, 40 different authors, 3 different languages over a millennia. Like, so there's something there's something supernatural with how this book gets put together. And the Bible is just the Greek word that means book. So like, there wasn't one person who sat down and wrote a book. But if the New Testament tells me anything, which I think it does, it tells me that the Bible is assembled by what you'll read it a lot in the New Testament, the apostles and the prophets. That is, that people who were empowered by God's Spirit to write out these stories or these narratives, and that got passed along to people. So for example, the first 5 books of the Bible are written by Moses, who is like probably considered the first prophet and probably the greatest prophet. And so what happened was, after he died, they would write down everything he said. He probably had a secretary or a scribe that followed him around, wrote it down. The thing is, they didn't have obviously paper that lasted forever. They wrote on papyrus. They wrote on pot fragments because papyrus fades over time. That's just it. So we don't actually have any original, what they call autographs, left, because they disintegrate. You cannot preserve them. It's why actually you can't take pictures in front of like the Mona Lisa anymore, because actually like the flash is causing the material, the canvas, to dissolve. And that's what happens with documents from 3,000 years ago. They obviously dissolve. The Jewish people knew that. So what they started to do was, they would be like, this is so important that our people need to remember it and meditate on it. And these are the words from God himself. And so what they would do is they would copy it, and they would take the old document, and that was their way of preserving it. Whereas like nowadays we take pictures and we upload them onto the cloud, and that's how we preserve a memory. Well, obviously before the information age, that was how they preserved the memory. And so what they would do is they would have people who literally sat down, and their chief job was to copy word for word. And what's crazy, I don't have time to go into the details, but there was a group called the Masoretes who literally, when they would write on the scroll, after they filled up a scroll, they would go letter by letter. And if there was one error on one of those copies, they burned it. They got rid of it, and they had to start from scratch. They were so peculiar with how they wrote down, that how they copied it, that literally they had to, if there was one letter that was off, like one typo, they literally chucked it. And so as these prophets were getting progressive messages from God, they saw it as, if God is speaking to us, we are literally going to write this down so that way people know. And so over time, as God was continuing to reveal his plan of how he was going to redeem the world, the Bible was like, people were writing it down. And if it was given through a prophet, they kept it. And so there wasn't like a bound up book where they were like, this is the Bible. They just knew this is from Moses. This is from Samuel. This is from David. This is from so-and-so. This is from Isaiah. This is from Jeremiah. And as they were collecting those messages, they were like, this is from God. This is important for us to remember because it reveals his plan and his purposes for us.
Yep.
And so around 400 BC is when the last book of the Old Testament was written. It was called the Hebrew Bible, or the Tanakh. And what's crazy is it's the same exact books that are in our Old Testament. There was no question. There was no additions. They literally had their 24 books are 39 because, First and Second Kings is one book in the Hebrew Bible, but they couldn't fit on one scroll. So that's why we call it First Kings, Second Kings. But in the Hebrew Bible, it's just called Kings.
Yep.
And so I say all this just to say, like, they were so good at copying, Evan, that we can have a huge degree of confidence that what's in our Bibles is what was originally written.
It's like, aren't we we're through manuscript evidence, we're up to like 99%
Totally.
approval rating. Yeah.
Like if we lost every Bible on earth, let's say they all got burned in every language, we still have enough manuscripts, like commentaries, like which are like basically people who wrote down portions of it to keep by them. What's called lectionaries. We have all of these things. We can make up the Bible 5,000 times over.
Yep.
Like we don't need our English Bibles anymore in terms of if we needed to copy it for future generations.
Yep.
I say all this just to say, like, just a cool story, because I know we probably have to wrap up soon. But so our Old Testament is translated off of what's called the Masoretic text, and it's it was probably, we think it's from around the time of like after 500 AD to about 1000 AD. The Masoretes in Israel wrote it down, and it's our most complete section of the Old Testament. We have a lot of, I think, all the scrolls for the Old Testament. And so for a long time, people who were didn't believe the Bible was legitimate would say, well, that obviously happened, centuries after the event. So I'm sure if we were to ever find something older, we'd see how many people have messed with the scroll and people are manipulating the story. Well, in 1948, a boy was playing out in, he was actually, I think he was a shepherd, but he was playing out near the Dead Sea, and he threw a rock into a cave and he threw a rock and he heard a shatter in there. And so he was like, what the heck is going on? So he went in the cave and he went and saw all these jars. And when he looked inside, he found hundreds and thousands of scrolls. And when biblical scholars came, they realized that they found what's now known as the Dead Sea Scrolls, which like has a ton of different scrolls. It has a complete scroll of Isaiah. And when scholars looked at it, they were like, this is 1,000 years older than the Masoretic text, like 900 years older. And they were like, I bet you once we analyze this, we're going to see that the Masoretes came in and changed everything. And when they analyzed it, they only found vowel marking changes, because the Hebrew language had added more vowel markings to make it a little bit clearer. But word for word, things were the same.
That's crazy.
And imagine after 900 years, if you write a paper and 900 years from now, someone else is copying your paper and it's word for word. How crazy is that? With like language changes and culture changes, yet there's some supernatural presence that wants to preserve what you said.
Yep. It's crazy.
And so for me, I'm like, the Bible is a legitimate book that we can have full confidence in because we have more evidence for it that it's legitimate, way more than the Constitution, way more than the Declaration of Independence, way more than anything Homer wrote in the Odyssey or anything Shakespeare wrote. We have like way more confidence that this is the legitimate word of God.
Yep.
And all the evidence is pointing that the stories in this are legitimate.
Yep.
So for me, like, I know I went way too long, but
You're okay.
I think there's a ton of evidence. Like, someone could have complete confidence in this book.
Yeah. And guys, we're going to wrap up. I mean, we could talk for hours on this, and we didn't even get into how the formation of the New Testament came to be. Totally. And even that is an incredible story, how they sought what was genuine from Jesus and they pushed away what was forged.
Yeah.
And it's just, it's incredible to see the wisdom. I love that. Just highlight some things. Joe, I love that you highlighted the wisdom of people who have walked with the Bible for millennia, and it's incredible to see the wisdom of many of the early church fathers who wisely composed the Bible that we get to use today in order to worship the Lord and hear from God. And so, guys, let that be an encouragement to you. The Bible is a gift. I hope that's what you get from this. It's not, don't be apathetic towards it. It's not just something that is a placeholder among other books in your closet. I remember, Joe, I don't know if you ever saw the Book of Eli with Denzel Washington, where he puts the Bible next to all the other major historical documents. Guys, the Bible is unique in many ways. And most of all, it tells the story of Jesus. And
and every other even religious book is written by an individual that claims that they heard from God.
In a single time.
You and I have a book that's written by 40 different people, yet has a coherent story about the one true God.
Absolutely.
And it's legitimate, so we can have confidence in it.
Absolutely, guys. So, hey, well, thanks for joining us. Once again, check that number in the description. If you have a question that you want dealt with, text us. We'd love to deal with it. Even if we can't deal with it during the video, you'll get a response from us, and we'd love to even talk with you about it on the phone, all right? So thanks for joining us, and we will see you guys hopefully this Thursday for a free Frosty. And if not, then we'll see you for our NHSM online on Thursday night at 7. All right, we'll see you guys later. Bye.